Well, good evening, everyone, and hopefully you can hear me all right. Thank you, Ruth. You have so many great things going on in Greeley. It's wonderful. So
We
I
try.
do appreciate being extended the offer. So Greeley's got it going on. I got to tell you guys, it's great. So my thanks to Ruth and the Water Conservation Group for inviting me to present tonight. I'm really excited to be here to share the next hour or so of things that you can do to put your garden to bed. And we're going to cover the landscape as a whole. So it's not just the vegetable garden, although of course we'll talk about that, but we're going to discuss all of the aspects of your landscape. My name is Allison O'Connor. I'm the horticulture agent in Larimer County, so you're adjacent county to Weld. And I do live in Windsor, so I'm actually a Weld County resident. And I've been with Extension for 15 years. And I absolutely love my job. I love my colleagues. And I'm really excited to present to you. I do have to give you a couple of more items. So Ruth provided you with a bunch of information. I do want to point you to our cohorts blog website. You can see the URL on the screen, and I will send Ruth a copy of the handouts that she can then share with all of you. So don't feel like you need to frantically write things down. You will get a copy of the presentation. But our cohorts blog not only has really great and timely blog articles, you can see that Miranda Ulmer just posted about grape season, but I also want to point you to the gardening webinars section. So CSU Extension is doing fall Friday webinars every Friday in fall, and the Weld County Hort agent Amy is teaching this Friday at noon. They are free, just like this series. And then we also have a bunch of other upcoming classes, plus we have also recorded a lot of classes since April. So check out the blog, read the material, and then jump on a webinar if that interests you. And remember, CSU is your outreach arm of the university. We're really happy to help you with all of your gardening needs. We have the 4-H program, and we do a bunch of things in your community. So I'm actually going to turn my camera off so that I don't distract you and I don't look at myself, which is always slightly unnerving to see. This is what we're going to cover tonight. So we'll go through what is frost exactly. We will then talk about each of the different gardening areas. And like Ruth said, I will have question breaks between each section. I do ask that you keep things on topic. It's very easy to rabbit trail down another path and stray away from the information, but in order to really keep the topic at hand, please try to focus your questions on what I'm discussing. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I do have to start things off with what is a frost. And I know a couple weeks ago we all had a scare where there was an absolute panic across the state of Colorado about the early fall temperatures that we were getting back just a couple weeks ago in early September. We were predicted to get, in some places, even in Larimer County, temperatures are supposed to dip into the teens. And fortunately, for whatever reason, that storm system didn't drop the really cold temperatures that it had predicted. And I had checked with Ruth yesterday to see if Greeley did actually experience a freeze. And she said you hovered right at about 32 degrees. So there are varying stages of frost. That's an important thing to note, that when we talk about frost, obviously it's everything below 32 degrees. But when we talk about killing plant material, there is varying stages. And it's interesting that even just a degree or two can make or break a plant and its damage that it might result from. So a light frost is anywhere in the 30 to 32 range. So back in early September, we did have a light frost where you might have seen some plants get a little bit nipped. You might have seen, especially some of the warm season plants, the ones that really like hot weather, they don't do well when temperatures get that cold. But where it gets serious for gardeners is when temperatures drop below 28 degrees. And so that's what we consider to be a hard frost. So 28, 26 degrees, that's when really it's what we call a killing frost, and the season is essentially over. What you should also know, though, is that as temperatures cool, when we get into those really chilly evenings, physiologically, the plant starts to slow its growth. So essentially, the plant kind of gets sluggish. So instead of having water move throughout the plant, when we get cool temperatures, some of that water almost becomes like gel. So it just gets kind of sluggish and plants don't respond well. And so just know that as we get cool nights, that's why you're seeing a decrease in plant growth. So I took a peek at our temperatures. This is your Greeley 10-day forecast of, are we going to have a frost in the next 10 days? And things look good. So other than that scare we had in early September, we're going to have a really nice long fall. What you'll also notice is that there is no rain predicted for the next 10 days. So if you do have plants that you want to keep maintaining, you will have to continue to water them. So temperatures are again in the 90s tomorrow and Friday, and then we'll get into some nice, what we call normal fall temperatures, which are 70s and low 80s. But again, looking at those nighttime temperatures, we're not looking at frost. Now this could change. Obviously, the weather people are only as good at predicting as their data shows. But just know that we seem to be out of the woods for at least another couple of weeks. So you can keep growing your tomatoes. Let's cover how you can extend the gardening season. So if you are a die-hard gardener that refuses to give up, that wants to keep things going as long as you possibly can, then you're likely employing some of these season extension techniques. So what you likely did in September and what I did was you covered plants with sheets, tarps, blankets, boxes, anything where you could trap the radiant heat from the earth and keep the plant warm. In this case, there is something I do want to point out. Using plastic or even a plastic tarp, not the most recommended technique. And the reason for that is that it gets a little bit too cold. So if we have that air basically falling down on the plant, so cold air is sinking, when it hits that plastic, it can actually cause more damage. So I would steer you away from using plastic, but then employ the use of bed sheets. And I can't remember if I was curious, like if there was a run on bed sheets and towels at the Ark or Goodwill the first couple weeks of September. But basically what you want to do is drape over those sheets, those blankets, anything, and again to trap the heat. So you do want to tuck it in at the bottom so the cold air doesn't come up into the plant. You will want to remove those sheets, tarps, etc. during the day because our temperatures, again, we have hot sun and the sun's radiant heat can actually do more damage. So put them on at night, take them off in the morning, and you will have to decide how much energy you have to keep doing this. One thing you could try is using holiday lights, and this is actually something I did. It was interesting that I was so fiercely protected of my little miniature pumpkins. I wasn't going to let them go down with the frost that we were predicted, that I actually strung holiday lights. And the fascinating thing is holiday lights, and these are the old incandescent style, not LEDs. They're not going to do this. You need to find the old school incandescent types. And if you string them around your plants and then cover them, they can actually moderate the temperature about 6 degrees. And so again, if we're in that zone where it could reach 28, if you cover with sheets and tarps, you might gain a couple degrees. If you add holiday lights, you might gain up to 6 more degrees. And so not only does it look cool and very festive, but it does serve a purpose. So again, if you can find some of those old holiday lights, they can really help extend the growing season. Specifically with annuals, and remember annuals are those plants that only grow for one growing season. So they usually start from seed, they complete their life cycle, and then they die with the first frost. So if you have annuals, if they're in containers, obviously you can bring them inside and outside into a garage or into your living space. If you can cover them with buckets, that's going to work as well. If you want to move annual plants like geraniums or some herbs indoors for the winter, you will want to quarantine them for a couple weeks in a different place in your home. Sometimes our outdoor plants can get hitchhikers, so they might have some disease or insects or things like that. And those are not things that you want to be bringing into the home and potentially sharing with your current indoor plants. And then also when you do bring them inside, monitor the water. So if they're an outdoor container where you're watering it every day, bringing them indoors is really going to drastically change how much water they need. And you might start going on a once a week basis. So that's where you'll need to start paying a little bit more attention. Their growth is naturally going to slow. When we have shortened days, all plant material stops, doesn't stop, but it's going to get much less, and so they're not going to need as much water. Another option for your annuals, like geraniums or rosemary, you could take cuttings, you could start a propagation process, or if you're like me, you made a decision that today is the day that I'm disposing of my plants and my trash bin is full for next year. I'm done. So that's just me. I'm tired of the growing season. If you want to plant some life back into your landscape because you've now, tossed all of your petunias, you can consider some of the cool season annuals that are readily available at the garden centers or even box stores and grocery stores. So the darling of the fall is, of course, the pansy. That is an annual. We do have some perennial pansies out there, and actually CSU is looking at some of the annuals that could be considered perennial pansies. But pansies, they're so cheerful, they bloom all the time, and they love cooler weather. So they're a great plant that you could incorporate into your garden if you're looking for some color. Another option is the ornamental kale. And then, of course, there's mums galore. So pumpkins and mums are the signature fall decorations. And mums are usually a perennial. So some of the mums you can buy, you could actually plant into the garden still this fall if it's something that you want for next year. Let's move into the vegetables. This is probably where most of you are focusing your attention. And so the big thing is that vegetables are still producing quite well. Even tomatoes are still producing fruit. It's important to note that we do have warm season and cool season vegetables. So cool season crops like carrots and beets and lettuce and broccoli, they really enjoy the cooler nights and the cooler weather. They're going to thrive when temperatures are below 65 degrees. So even right now with our temperatures in the upper 80s and 90s, those plants are not entirely happy. As temperatures cool off, some of those plants also become sweeter. So their sugars start to concentrate, and so you might get a different tasting carrot in the fall than you would during the summer months. Apparently, kale becomes sweeter too. I'm not a huge fan of kale, so I don't think you could convince me that kale is sweet. That's a hard sell. But just know that sometimes with those cool season crops, getting a nip of frost or a crisp, cool fall day, they're actually going to concentrate some of those sugars and make them taste better. What's important to note is that the air temperature might be cold, but the soils, because we have this mass of earth, it's going to hold the warmth of the soil for a lot longer than the air temperature. So even if we get a string of 60-degree days, the soil is going to remain warm, which behooves your plants because obviously, especially with root crops like carrots, they're going to benefit from those warm temperatures. And in Colorado, our soils don't generally freeze until sometime in November. It could even be December depending on our fall. So right now, even if we do get a frost in the next couple weeks, the soils are still going to remain warm. So that's beneficial for those cool season crops. So can you still plant fall crops? You're going to be pushing it, I'm not going to lie, and you're going to have to employ the use of season extension. You might be able to do it. Again, I can't predict what the weather is going to be like past that 10-day forecast that I found, but you could try, and if you're willing to give it a shot, by all means. So you could plant some of these really quick crops like radishes. There are some radish varieties that only have 25 days to harvest. So the moment you plant the seed, you can hopefully harvest them in about a month. Arugula and spinach, some of our greens, you might get some growth. You could get tops of beets. You likely won't get the actual tuber forming on the beet itself, but you could get beet greens, and you could also get that infamous kale. If you love kale, now is the time to plant. But really, if you want to do fall crops, early August is a better time so that you have 2 full months to get a harvest. So if you wanted to plant peas or a second crop of broccoli, those plants needed to be started much earlier in the fall, and you're looking at more August or even mid-July in some cases. So You can try it. Seeds are cheap. It's not a huge investment on your part, but you do need to maintain watering. That's the big thing. You can celebrate National Kale Day on October 2nd. Mark your calendars because kale is amazing. So people say. But no, kale is really good for you, and I laugh. It's just not my favorite, and that's okay. So I love people who grow and eat kale. More power to you. Munch on those kale chips. Maybe you're doing it now, but mark your calendars for October 2nd because that is National Kale Day. Let's move into potatoes. We'll talk about some specific crops. So potatoes are becoming far more common for homeowners, gardeners to grow. And I've grown potatoes for the last several years in containers. Very easy. They do really well, and I just happen to not grow them this year. But if you're growing potatoes, the big thing that if the vines freeze, the tubers will be fine, but you do need to harvest them ASAP. So potatoes can really be harvested anytime starting in August, September. It just depends on the size of potato that you want. If you like little guys, you can harvest in August and September. If you want bigger potatoes or a more developed tuber, you would wait until now. But just know that if you keep waiting, you do need to be cognizant of when those vines freeze. When you harvest your potatoes, you don't want to wash them. You'll just kind of gently brush off the soil. So one thing I do is when I harvest my potatoes, I dump them all out, and it is really fun. It's a great thing for kids and grandkids because it's almost like finding gold. Like how many potato tubers can you actually find? But just brush off the soil and then let them chill in the basement. So store in a cool, dry place or wherever that would work in your household. It is best not to put them in the refrigerator because it can actually trigger them to grow. If you wash them, just know that you'll have to use them or preserve them quickly because they can spoil with that moisture added. Tomatoes are the big one, and with tomatoes, this is something that we could have made efforts to do about a month ago. So in early to mid-September, you want to start taking off any new flowers that are starting to form. If you think about a plant and think about the energy it takes to produce a flower and then a fruit, it takes a lot of energy. So you may right now have a ton of green tomatoes still on your plants because they're putting energy into producing more fruit as opposed to focusing their energy on just ripening what's on the plant. So in early to mid-September of next year, make sure that you are pruning off any of the new growth, new flowers, small fruits, because especially for larger tomato varieties, they're unlikely to ripen in time before the first frost comes. And again, it puts more resources into ripening what's already on the plant. Before a first hard frost, again, at 26 to 28 degrees, you will want to pick all the fruit if you're unable to move your tomato inside or cover it appropriately. And you can pick green tomatoes, and maybe you did this when we had the frost scare. You can pick the green tomatoes, they will ripen. I don't eat tomatoes, so I've been told that the flavor isn't quite as pronounced or as good as a vine-ripened tomato, but it's not bad. It's probably better than what you can get at the grocery store. So take all of your green fruit and store it in a well-ventilated area, maybe a single layer in a cardboard box top, and just allow them to naturally ripen. I've had master gardeners who have had ripe tomatoes from their garden into November. They brag every year that on Thanksgiving they're eating homegrown tomatoes from their garden because they are doing this process. The cooler you keep the tomatoes, the longer it's going to take for them to ripen. So finding a place in your house that is going to be well ventilated and right at that sweet spot of 55 to 70 degrees is going to be good. Don't put the tomatoes into the fridge unless you're going to eat them within a short time period. So refrigerated tomatoes are not good eats, and they won't ripen when they're in the fridge either. That's just a little bit too cold. If you happen to be out of town and your tomatoes get frosted and they turn mushy on the vine, that's the time when you need to say goodbye. It's not that you couldn't eat them, I just don't think they would be very desirable. The big thing is that anytime tomatoes get frosted, you shouldn't preserve them. So it's not something that you should use for canning or freezing. because it can change the acidity levels and it could potentially make you sick. So that's the big thing. So you could eat mushy brown tomatoes from a frosted plant, but I would guess that you would move on to other options. With peppers, they're pretty similar to tomatoes, another warm season crop. So if they get frosted, they're not going to look very appealing. And the plants themselves can turn black very quickly. So you will know almost immediately. I think tomatoes are a little more tolerant of cooler temperatures than peppers are, but you'll know, the peppers will tell you if it got a little bit too cold for them, and it will affect the resulting fruit. So again, before that first frost, get out and harvest all of the peppers. Again, they may not be as hot as you want if they're a hot pepper. They may not be fully formed if they're a bell pepper, but again, it's going to be better than letting them go. So you've taken all the time to grow them this summer. You might as well harvest them and enjoy them as you're able. So peppers are a big one that you want to get harvested before frost. If you're growing pumpkins, so I grew miniature pumpkins this year. I'm obsessed with miniature pumpkins. I love them. The big thing to know, it's kind of hard to tell when your pumpkins are ready to harvest. So the stems should dry out. They shouldn't be green any longer, like that plant green. In this case, you'll notice that it's kind of a steel blue green. But the biggest thing is that the stems shouldn't puncture with a fingernail if they're ready to harvest. So those stems should be very firm, and you shouldn't be able to make an indentation in the stem itself. If you decide to store these instead of just using them for decorations, you should get them harvested before a hard frost. So again, that 26, 28 degree temperature, that's what you need to be looking for. Get them out of the garden. A hard frost can actually cause some cellular damage to the rinds, and they may not store as long. So that's a big thing. They can tolerate temperatures in the low 30s. Your pumpkins were probably fine, and they may not be ready yet. It's been, I've seen a lot of pumpkins that are still very green. So just know that you're looking at two things. The rind should be nice and firm, and then also the stem shouldn't be able to be punctured. Storing winter squash and pumpkins, they can store for many months, 2 to 3 months or longer. Again, if they're in a well-ventilated area. A root cellar is ideal. I don't know how many people have a root cellar these days. I certainly don't. But anywhere between, just above freezing 32, 35 degrees up to 60 degrees is going to be ideal to store those. You do want to give them space, so make sure that they're not touching each other. If the rinds touch each other, it can cause soft spots and early rot. So make sure that you're giving them adequate space. And again, if you happen to leave your pumpkins in the field and you don't get them harvested before frost, you can still use them. They're perfectly safe to use. It's the storage issue that we're worried about. So if they get frosted, just can them, freeze them, eat them within a day or two after that event. One thing I would encourage you to do is plant garlic. If you've never planted garlic, or you feel like you don't have any talents in the vegetable growing area, I actually feel that way. I'm not a very good vegetable gardener. I kill it with garlic because it is the easiest thing to plant, and you look like a hero in July. So buy some bulbs at your local garden center. Make sure you're not buying bulbs from the grocery store, because oftentimes they are treated with a growth inhibitant. So they may not sprout for you, and they're usually not varieties that are going to do well in Colorado. So either buy bulbs online, or buy them from your local garden center. And all you do is you get the bulb of garlic, and it has all those cloves. You break them apart and you plant them in the ground. You water them in. You might water them a couple times during the winter, and then you would water as a normal crop starting in the spring. So plant with the pointy end up, and the part where it attached to the bulb itself, you point that down and plant them 2 to 3 inches deep. So here's kind of a blurry picture. This is in my garden where I planted garlic. So space them out about 6 inches apart, and again, plant them 2 to 3 to 4 inches deep. Cover them with soil, water them in. You can put some leaf clippings on there, or grass clippings. And then next summer, when the tops are about half withered, when they're about half brown, that's when you would then harvest, and you will have garlic to share with your friends and families, unless you are part vampire and you love garlic. But really, it is such an easy crop, and I don't think people realize how easy it is to plant garlic. You can get into garlic. There's hard neck, there's soft neck, and there's different flavors of it as well. So once you start investigating the types of garlic, you will find a new world that might open up many windows for you. And with the vegetable garden, it is important to do some fall cleanup. So I should have changed that. We didn't have a wet spring. I worded that wrong. It was a very dry spring. But still, even though we had a dry spring and fairly dry summer, we had a lot of fungal and disease issues this year. I saw a lot more virus. I saw a lot more bacterial issues than I normally do. And the big thing is if you suspect or had anything confirmed that your vegetable garden was diseased or had insects, you need to take all of that plant material and throw it in the trash. So haul it out of the garden. Don't let it sit there in a heap during the winter months, because sometimes the spores can overwinter. Sometimes we get eggs from insects that will overwinter, and it will re-inoculate your garden next year. So that's a really important thing. So make sure that you are harvesting and getting rid of the plant material, and it is tough. But composting, and Ruth will probably tell you this when she does her presentation in a couple weeks, our home compost usually doesn't get hot enough to kill a lot of these disease pathogens. So that is a big thing. Make sure you're throwing it in the trash. For next year, for your vegetable garden, if you struggled, you're not alone. Just know that there's many gardeners, myself included, who really had a tough season. But make a note of where you planted things. Try to practice good crop rotation. It is hard in the home vegetable garden to really practice proper crop rotation, but if you planted tomatoes in the same spot for 3 years, move them somewhere else, or maybe put them in containers next summer. Remove all the trellises, tomato cages. It's recommended that you spray them down with a light bleach solution. That is an option. It is recommended. And then if your garden was a total bust, maybe you've been working the soil for many years and it just seems kind of tired, you could consider still doing a cover crop this fall, or you could do one next year and just leave that area fallow. I know that it's prime real estate, but doing a cover crop and then either tilling in or working in the cover crop as green manure will add a lot of good nutrients to your soil. It will add some more life to your soil, and you can get a lot of cover crop seed choices either online or at local garden centers as well. So what questions do you have on vegetables? Anything that I didn't cover or anything that needs clarification? Carol, I see that you shared a comment with us that you kept the tomatoes on the vines and hung them upside down. That is a brilliant idea, Carol. I love that idea. So cut them off at the base and then just hang them upside down, and the tomatoes will ripen and you will have ripe red tomatoes for quite a while. And Melissa is all about that tip. So look at you, Carol, inspiring others. Well done.
So if the people wanted to do a cover crop, where would you suggest getting the vetch? Or
I would actually go to one of the online vegetable seed companies. There are so many, and they actually sell cover crops. That said, I know that some of the local tractor or farm supply stores also have cover crops as well. So I'm not as familiar with Greeley since I work in Larimer County, but I know that Jack's Farm and Ranch had a good cover crop mix that they were selling. And I also know that some of the local nurseries will have it as well. So, we have a really good publication on cover crops. If you just Google CSU Extension cover crops, it's pretty lengthy and it covers a lot of the great material.
Okay, it looks like we have a question in the question and answer. Does wind chill affect plants when it comes to frost temps?
Yes, and so if it is windy, actually sometimes wind is a good thing because it moves the air around. It's the cold, still nights that tend to be a little bit more problematic. But yes, wind chill can absolutely affect plants. If you think about a poor leaf on a plant, any sort of wind or chilling injury that it could get could make things worse. So hopefully we don't have to worry about that. That's usually a winter thing, but sometimes it can be a factor. Great question.
Okay, Chris is asking, could you say more about quarantining plants?
Yeah, so it's a fairly simple process. So anything that you want to bring indoors that isn't going to survive outside for the winter, you just want to put in a separate space. So if you have a patio or a bathroom that you don't use, you're going to bring those plants inside for perhaps a week or two. You'll keep an eye on it. You'll look to see if there's any sort of insects that are coming out. The big thing is that sometimes outdoor insects can move indoors and then they can affect your indoor plants. And so you're just monitoring to make sure that you're not introducing anything into your indoor life. That's the biggest thing. A lot of those insects aren't going to survive indoors, but still you don't want to create a problem. I see in the chat that Karen asked, are sheets still okay to cover plants for frost protection if it rains? Would tarps be better? That is a great question, and it just depends. Obviously, wet material, frozen wet material is never a good thing. So you could do a sheet and then cover it with a tarp, especially if we're getting any moisture on top. It's an extra step. And again, you have to make sure that it's worth doing. It takes quite a bit of energy, as you probably know, to get things protected from those cold temps. Okay, I'm going to move on to perennials. Oh, snow, what's that? So perennial care in the garden, you don't need to do a lot with perennials, which is a really nice thing. So they're usually low maintenance, but you can consider doing a few things in the fall. And so there's really two schools of thought. There's the, should I clean up or should I just wait until spring? And for the most part, it kind of depends on where you're at. So if you are just done, that is okay. But if you are, I'm going to do it, I'm going to get my garden looking great, I'm going to have a nice, neat landscape going into the spring, absolutely, that is something that you can do. So removing foliage and flowers will also remove any potentially overwintering insects, insect eggs, and diseases that can overwinter in the garden. So kind of the same rule or the same school of thought with the vegetable garden. So sometimes we have things that remain on our perennials during the winter months that can re-affect things next year. It also gives your garden kind of a neat and tidy appearance. I will also say with that, it looks a little bleak. Everything is cut back, there's not a lot of structure. So, you know, there are two trains of thought there. If you do clean up in the fall, it will give you less to do in the spring. And we all know how busy we are in the spring and how much energy some of those things take. So that's a school of thought. The other attitude is, I need a break. I just want to watch football. I want to put on my comfy pants and sit on the couch, and that's okay too. So leaving perennials standing gives structure and winter texture to the garden. It can also give food for birds. So in the case of coneflowers or sometimes ornamental grass seed heads, that's fine. There's also a thought that if you leave plants standing, they're more likely to collect any snow or precipitation that falls. So they kind of gather it on those leaves. And it also can help buffer temperatures as well. So any sort of snow cover that the plants receive not only adds moisture to the crown of the plant, but it can also help buffer some of those winter temperatures, which can be very important. Reasons to clean up in the fall are to, again, eliminate any overwintering organisms. So this year, my peonies had a banner year for powdery mildew, the worst year ever, and by August, they looked horrible. So I actually cut all of my peonies back. I just didn't want to deal with it, plus they looked terrible. Remove most of the perennial foliages as it starts to die down, but I would suggest that you leave plants with winter texture. So again, coneflowers, which provide food for birds. I would leave your ornamental grasses. A lot of them will stay nice and upright, and they're not going to lodge or fall over. In the fall months, you can leave poppies, you can leave black-eyed Susan. So anything that you might find interesting in the bleak months of December and January, I would leave them in the garden and only harvest and then cut them back in the spring. But again, it's totally up to you. If you don't like the look of ornamental grasses in the winter, cut them back. It's not going to hurt anything. Again, it's totally subjective. The only reason I would remove them is if you had disease or insect pressure. With our perennials, it's also important to mulch. So mulching plants, especially perennials, especially newly planted perennials. So if you are hitting up the garden centers for some of their sales, it is a really good thing to mulch those plants well in the fall. they do have time still to get their roots established. So you can still plant perennials, but giving them an extra layer of mulch will help them get through the winter, because sometimes they might heave out of the soil. If you've ever seen that, where the moisture around the plant freezes and then actually causes the plant to heave out of the soil. And what you want to protect is the crown of perennials. That's where the growth is going to occur. Mulching also helps to protect plants from wind. It helps to prevent soil moisture loss and all of those good things. So mulch is a really important thing, and I would say that if your landscape as a whole needs a refresher with mulch, it's a good time to put down some wood mulch. Now, you can use any mulch you want. It can be the colored stuff that's safe for gardens. It can be free stuff that's the old Christmas trees that the City of Greeley chipped. Really doesn't matter. It comes down to what you like in your landscape. So perennials was pretty short because there's not a lot to do, but are there any questions on perennial care or maintaining perennials for the winter months? So Melissa wanted to know what was the one on the initial perennial slide. Let me go back. This one? That's a miscanthus. That's an ornamental grass. Really nice perennial. It's a big one. So it can get 5-6 feet tall, but it has beautiful blooms. Really nice. Well, you don't know what it's called, so you don't know what to do with it. So miscanthus is a very common grass, and so I think it's a cool season grass. Amy, if you're on, correct me on that one. But it's a cool season grass, so you can leave it standing in the winter months, or you can cut it back. It can get very, very wide at the base, up to 5 feet. And my coworker Amy is teaching a class this Friday on ornamental grasses. Yes, they can get very large, so maybe 5 feet is conservative for the height of those.
We have a couple questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Can perennials come inside in pots?
You could bring perennials inside in pots. What I would point out is that most perennials need a period of rest. I wouldn't expect them to do all that well indoors. So that is one thing. They probably will still go dormant. They probably won't look great, but you could try to bring them indoors.
And then, are there any perennials you mustn't cut back?
No, there are none that you mustn't cut back. It's really a personal choice and how much you want to look at during the garden months or during the winter months.
Okay, how much water should perennials get in the winter?
You know, that's a tough one. When we get to water, it's a hard thing to answer. It would depend on the perennial. So if they are newly planted, I would say if they're planted this fall, those are the ones that you'll want to focus your watering on. If they're a xeric or a native plant that has been in your landscape for a few years, you don't really need to add any supplemental irrigation to those. So focus watering with watering, I always say that some watering is better than no watering. So you could give them some. It doesn't have to be a lot. Just try to keep the plant moist overall.
And that's if there's no snow. If you've got snow
Yes.
cover, they're fine.
That's true. And yes, thank you. Miscanthus is a warm season grass. So that's one that will green up a little bit later into the spring. So you will cut it back once you start to see new growth at the base.
Roseanne wants to know if you can or should apply amendments to soil before mulching.
So should you? Okay, Roseanne, this is a tough question because you're asking kind of the wrong gal. I would say, so this is my rule of thumb, that if you are planting appropriate plants for our region, such as water-wise plants or xeric plants, or they're the same thing, native plants, they don't really like a lot of supplemental amendments. They can get by with essentially what our soils naturally provide them. The only thing I would recommend is that if you have a brand new landscape and you're able to amend the entire landscape, that's a good approach. But simply amending 1 or 2 plants, the research has shown that it doesn't do a lot of great benefit. The other thing is any organic mulch that you add, if it's wood mulch or if it's leaves, it's going to provide good organic material to the soil and help improve the soil in that manner.
Okay, I'm going to do one more and then I'm going to answer one by typing an answer.
Okay.
Do perennials like coneflower also propagate by seeds?
Yes.
In other words,
oh, yes.
2-part question. In other words, do you discard when you deadhead?
So I have found that my coneflowers are one of the most reseeding perennials in the landscape, and I have found them to escape in many areas. Maybe you found the same, Ruth, in the xeriscape gardens, if you have them there, but yes, they will propagate by seed, and you will find them in random places. So if you don't want them to grow elsewhere, when you deadhead, you can throw away the spent flower and move on. But you know, if you don't mind it, if you like the birds, if you are willing to deal with the aftermath of the reseeding, you can leave them up. But yes, they can reseed. And I'll do the one from Maureen about should you fertilize perennials in the fall? You know, for the most part, I would say if they're growing well, fertilizer isn't going to be necessary. If you want to add a starter fertilizer when you plant, that would be okay. But again, it really depends on what you're planting. Natives don't need a lot of fertilizer. Water-wise plants don't need a lot of fertilizer. So you would kind of judge that based on the overall health of the plants. Leaves. This is probably one of the questions I get the most is how do I deal with all of the leaves that fall? And I know that it can be frustrating. My mom moved from Minnesota to Oregon, and in her backyard in Minnesota, she had 8 mature oak trees. Now, for those of you who think you have leaf problems, my mom had major leaf problems. And if you know oaks, you'll know that they shed leaves a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit. And so for my mom, it was like 2 months of leaf duty. She got very frustrated. I think she's happy to be in Oregon now. So obviously our trees, our deciduous trees, are going to lose leaves as we go into the winter months. And leaves can be really beneficial, and it's pretty easy to deal with them. So instead of sending them to the landfill, please, 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 I implore you to find a use for them in your landscape. Don't just bag them up and send them off to the landfill, because you can use them in many different ways unless it's just too much. So the first leaf use is to just mow them into the lawn. So with your lawnmower, take the bag off, and you might not be actually mowing the grass, but what your goal is to break up that leaf material. So make a couple passes. Your neighbors will think you're nuts. Make patterns in the lawn, but essentially what you're doing is chopping those leaves into little bits. The great thing about leaving them on the lawn, if possible, is that it's returning nutrients to the soil. So there's your soil amendments. That's a good thing. It provides food for earthworms. It holds better moisture. And a really cool study at Michigan State found that it reduces perennial weeds like dandelions. And the thought is that as those leaf bits, those little shredded leaves, filter down into the soil, they might help smother some of the weed seeds that we get. And so over time, over a period of, I think they found 3 years, they actually had a significant reduction in perennial weeds like dandelions because the weed seeds didn't have a chance to germinate. So with the lawn, as long as you can still see green grass after mowing, it's fine. Those leaves are going to break down. They're going to add good organic matter. I know it doesn't look ideal because your lawn is covered in these leaf bits, but again, it's going to break down and it's not going to harm the lawn as a whole. And it's the easiest way to deal with leaves is simply mow them into the lawn. Another thing you could do, you could take leaves and you could use them around plants. So if you have roses or if you have newly planted perennials, as we just discussed, this is basically using the leaves as a mulch. So they act as a nice blanket. You could gather the leaves and then pack them around the plants. Sometimes people will add like a wire cage and then stuff leaves into the wire cage to keep them in place. Or you could just leave them to naturally fall around the plants and then do a cleanup in the spring. That tends to be what I do is I let them fall, and partially it's because I'm lazy, but then I let them fall for the winter months and then rake them up in the spring. Disease leaves, yeah, leaving them on the landscape can cause problems, but a lot of the diseases we see are problems that we see every year. So usually not a big deal. And then again, rake them up in the spring. Another way to use leaves is to put them in the vegetable garden. So this is where you could put the bagger attachment on your mower, mulch them into the mower, and then add all of that material to your garden. Let it sit all winter, and then you could work it into the soil the following year. That's going to provide good organic matter. It's going to help with soil tilth. And again, you don't want to use whole leaves. So don't leave whole leaves on the lawn because we can see some diseases that occur if we leave whole leaves on the lawn, and the same thing for your vegetable garden. So you do want to break up the leaf material before you're using it. And Ruth's class is going to talk about compost. So join her class in a couple weeks. Leaves are gardener's gold. They're great because they break down really quickly and they add to a beneficial compost system. And it's a really easy form of recycling. So again, please don't send them to the landfill. Try to find a use for them in the landscape. You can bring them to some of the waste sites. I know in Fort Collins, they will take your leaves, they will compost them for you, and then they will sell you that compost back in the spring. Or you could try doing it yourself. So leaves I know can be a pain, but keep on top of them and make piles for the kids to play in. So are there any questions on leaves that we have?
Okay, we have one. I have a tree with fire blight. Should I pick them up for disposal?
Can you clarify, is it the branches or the leaves? Or I could try to answer from both perspectives. If you are removing any sort of diseased tree material like fire blight from a tree, you do want to throw that in the trash. The leaves on fire blight are going to basically wither on the plant. It's not like they're not likely to fall to the ground, but if you do see some fall to the ground, or you had black spot on rose, or you had Marsanina on your aspens, it is recommended that you rake those up, those diseased leaves, if you rake them up and then throw them in the trash.
When I compost leaves, this is Sally, she wants to know, when I compost leaves, do I need to turn them over during the winter?
So are you and Ruth, if you could help me with this since you're at Miss Compost, is she turning them in a bin or is she just putting them outside in the garden?
Well, maybe I can attack it while she's typing. I'm a lazy composter, so I turn my compost maybe twice a year. And I throw it all in the fall, okay, outside in a pile. So I turn it like in the fall when I put it in, add water, add my grass clippings and leaves, because that gives me kind of a good combination of my browns and my greens. And then I don't really worry about it. Now, the more you turn it, the faster you're going to get your compost. But usually if I do it that way, and then I also throw in, I know Sally and she knows I have chickens, I also throw in chicken manure. That usually gets it pretty hot pretty fast for me. And I can, by spring, I have my gold, my brown rich gold, golden brown compost. I have another one from Naomi. If you leave a lot of leaves through the winter, is it more important to aerate in the spring? And I'm assuming that's maybe in your grass, is what you're asking.
If you leave a lot of leaves, no. So maybe you're thinking that leaves will add to thatch or a potential problem. By the spring, the leaves will have decomposed and become organic matter. So we do recommend aerating at least once during the season. Twice is better. Fall or spring is fine. It hasn't been proven to be a better time. But if you mulch leaves into the lawn, it doesn't mean that you should or must aerate in the spring. You could also aerate in the fall. Hopefully that answers your question. So let's talk about trees. Trees are important. I would say that trees are probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, investment you have in your landscape. And losing a tree is hard on anyone, so we do want to make sure that our trees survive and have good fall care. So keep watering. This is a tough thing, I know, because we're starting to get our sprinklers blown out and we're not in any position where we're getting any rain or snow. So it is something that you have to dedicate yourself to, is to water your trees and shrubs. Once you've blown out your sprinklers, leave it off. Make sure you're switching to a hose and sprinkler or a bucket or some other method of watering. The biggest thing is it is important to keep your soils moist going into the winter. Water is going to act like an insulator and help protect those roots. So dry soils in the fall leading into winter can actually result in more tree death or dieback. So that is an important thing. Keeping the soil consistently moist through the year is going to be one of the best things you can do for your trees and shrubs in order to keep them healthy. Fall and winter watering is a strange thing if you've moved to Colorado from other parts of the United States, but it's a very, very regular practice that you should be doing. We just haven't had a lot of regular snow. And even last year when we did get snow, it was a dry snow. So remember that snow only gives us a certain amount of moisture depending on how wet it is. So when we get those wet fall and spring snowstorms, it might only take 8 inches to give us an inch of water. During the winter months, if we have a dry snow, it may take up to 15 inches of snow to give us 1 inch of water. And last year, for the most part, our snows were very dry. They didn't give us a lot of moisture and they didn't rehydrate the soil properly. So with fall and winter watering, if more than 30 days elapse without significant, which is about an inch, significant precipitation, then you should make an effort to water your trees and shrubs. Newly planted plants would go into this category, so perennials and things like that. Focus your efforts on watering when days are above 40 degrees as early in the day as possible so the water has time to sink in at night. For trees, you're aiming to water about 5 to 10 gallons per inch of diameter. Again, it's not an exact science. Anything is better than nothing. So some water, even if it's just a couple gallons, is going to be better than no water. And again, use a hose and sprinkler. And we have a whole fact sheet on this subject. So it's CSU fact sheet number 7.211. If you Google fall and winter watering Colorado, that will be the first publication that comes up. Also with trees, it's important to mulch. So we talked about this with perennials, but it's going to help stabilize the soil temperatures, it's going to help prevent water loss, and it's going to add organic matter. I am a huge advocate of keeping your trees mulched for their entire life, from the moment you plant until the moment they're no longer in the landscape. Mulch is such a good thing, and there's been some really great studies done at the Morton Arboretum in Illinois where they have found that mulch, even on 30 and 40-year-old trees, is extremely beneficial. So keep mulch up, that's a good thing. If you have young trees that you have recently planted or trees that are only a couple years old that have thin bark, it is a good idea to get some tree wrap and make sure that you wrap them somewhere around mid-November and then remove that tree wrap somewhere around mid-April. You want to focus only on thin bark trees because they're the ones that can get sun scald or frost cracks. So you may see wounds on the trunk on the south or the southwest side of the tree, and that's the side of the tree that heats up. So the sun is lower during the winter months, and so the south and southwest side is the side that gets the most exposure from that low winter sun. Some of our thin bark trees include lindens, maples, ginkgos, fruit trees. So if you planted peach or apple this summer, buckeyes, all of those trees are going to benefit from tree wrap. It's not something you need to do for the rest of the tree's life, but you're focusing on doing it for the first 3 to 4 years. And again, it's just from November to April. If you're not sure what sun scald looks like, this is a shot of my linden in my front yard that I just took moments before I started this presentation. I did wrap this tree for maybe 2 years and then I kind of forgot. I'm not the best gardener, I will admit that. But anyway, sun scald can occur. This faces west and you can see the damage that has occurred. Now, if you have trees with old wounds, and this is an old wound, you can see that the callus tissue has formed over the wound. There's nothing you can do at this point, and it's not worth wrapping at this point either. The damage is done, but if you have newly planted trees, make sure that you are wrapping them. Frost cracks can occur. They're usually vertical splits in the trunk, and again, both of these are temperature related. On warm winter days, the cells wake up. They start to move some water and nutrients up and down in the trunk, and then at night when the temperature drops, those cells burst and they freeze, and that's what causes the either sun scald or the frost crack. So it can cause damage to the tree. Also, it looks bad, and tree wrapping will prevent this. Use the crepe paper style. You can get this at most garden centers or box stores. I would avoid any sort of plastic tree wrap. So by the crepe paper style, start at the base, overlap by a third, and then end your wrap at the first branch. Somehow adhere it, tie it off. A lot of professional tree care companies just use a piece of duct tape. However you can get it to stay is a big thing, and then try to avoid having your beagle, of which I have one, chew it off during the winter months because she's bored. That has happened more than once in this household. So any tree questions?
Does watering around the surface of trees raise roots up through the lawn?
That's a great question, and no, it doesn't. So contrary to popular belief, a lot of our tree roots are actually quite shallow, and there are some species that are more notorious surface rooters than others. So ash is one, maples are one, aspen are one, and a lot of them will just grow more shallowly. If you're a root, it makes sense to grow in the upper profile of the soil because there's more moisture, there's better soil oxygen, two things that you need as a root in order to do well. So when we encourage watering, we do encourage you to try to water as deeply as possible, but that might only be 6 to 12 inches deep. So surface watering does not encourage surface rooting.
Okay, Chris is asking, should aspen trees be watered also or wrap them?
So aspens, oh, that's another conversation, Chris. But aspens, if they're young, they would probably benefit from being wrapped. And yes, all trees need to be watered, even if they're native. And this is for young trees. So all trees, regardless if they're old, young, native, non-native, they are going to benefit from winter watering. It's just Colorado's winters are just so dry, and we see so many problems from trees that were not watered properly throughout the year. We see a lot of drought stress as a result.
Abra wants to know, will trees survive or have shortened lives with sun scald or frost cracks?
Yes, they can. Basically, you're causing a lot of external damage to the bark. And any sort of frost crack, the tree has to reallocate how it moves water nutrients up the trunk. And so it has to go around those portions. So if you don't have that section of the tree functioning, it can cause some stress to the tree.
Okay, here's a good one from Rachel. Do we water just at the trunk area, or do I need to water further out? This is such a good question because it's so important.
A good question. And Rachel, thank you, because I should have brought that up. So for trees, if they're newly planted, you're focusing your efforts on the root ball. That's where you're going to water. If they are established trees or establishing trees, you're focusing your watering efforts on the drip line, which is where the canopy extends over the soil. So watering a large mature ash tree at the base is not going to do much good. Watering at the drip line of where the canopy is much more efficient. And that's where having a hose and sprinkler is going to be far easier to water than to use a bucket. So little guys at the base, bigger guys at the drip line.
Peggy wants to know, is fall the best time to plant or transplant trees, and how late?
Great question, Peggy. Fall is a great time to plant, and we apparently still have a long window based on our forecast. Try to get all trees and shrubs planted by the middle of October. The only thing that I would caution planting in the fall are evergreens. While our deciduous trees will get some good rooting, our evergreens have the added bonus, if you will, of keeping their needles all year. And so they can lose water during the winter months and they could become more damaged from fall planting. So save evergreens for spring only, spring and summer, but you can plant deciduous stuff well into mid-October.
What is the drip line?
Oh, the drip line. So the canopy. So if you think of a tree, where the canopy extends, I'm flailing my arms because I'm trying to show you. But the canopy is the diameter of how far that tree extends. That is where the drip line is. So if you go down from where the branches extend and go straight down to the ground, that would be considered the drip line. Please let me know. I can come on camera if I need to show you, but please let me know if that doesn't make sense or didn't clarify it. Let's briefly talk about lawn care. This talk is gone by really quickly. So there is a question of, should I mow shorter in the fall? I get this question every year where people hear that maybe mowing shorter is going to be more beneficial for the lawn. It keeps it nice and short for the winter months. And it is a myth. Basically what you want to do is focus on one turf height all year and just keep it at that height. It doesn't prevent more spring disease or fungal problems. And so keeping your lawn at a height of 2.5 to 3 inches tall, 3.5, however tall you want it is just fine. And keep obeying the 1/3 rule when you mow. The 1/3 rule is essentially that you're not removing any more than 1/3 of the total leaf tissue when you mow. So you don't want to go from 4 inches down to 2 inches. That would be removing 50%. That can be very stressful to the lawn and actually kill some roots. So you want to go from 4 inches down to 3 inches or 3 inches down to 2 inches, but you're just taking off just that top layer. It keeps the lawn looking a lot neater. You're not going to make hay and leave piles of grass behind you. So maintain that practice through the fall. And what about fall lawn fertilization? So you might get ads from your lawn care company, or you might see fertilize now in the fall at a garden center or a box store. And fertilizer in the fall is a great practice. But here's a little myth. The Winter Guard or the winterizer fertilizer that you might be buying, if you actually look at the nutrients in those bags, so we have regular Scott's Turf Builder on the left, we have the winterizer on the right, and if you look at the nutrients, it's 2904 and 2803. Essentially, they're the same thing. But we love this marketing gimmick because it gets you to fertilize, and fall is probably and arguably the best time to fertilize your lawn. But don't think that you need to apply a winterizer product. You can use the same fertilizer all year. You can use Turf Builder all year. You can use Rich Lawn all year. You can use Milorganite all year. All of the fertilizers are going to work. They just will vary in their nutrient content. So winterizer is a great marketing tool, and fall is a great time to fertilize. So ideally, if you don't fertilize too often, we would say maybe fertilize once around Labor Day and again before October 15th. Apply 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. That sounds really fancy, but essentially every bag of fertilizer you buy will say turn your fertilizer spreader to this number, and that will give you 1 pound of nitrogen. Make sure that you are watering in the fertilizer after application. So because we're dry, we're not getting a lot of precipitation, you'll have to run your sprinklers to water it in, and make sure that you're obeying your watering days appropriately. But fertilizing in the fall will help with spring green up. It might help recover with some of the wear and tear that you've had on the lawn. And the biggest thing is really try to get that final fall fertilizer application down by October 15th. There's been some interesting studies in other parts of the United States that fertilizing later can actually lead to runoff and leaching, which we don't want to do. We want to keep fertilizer within the turf system. So try to get it down by October 15th. Other lawn care tips, we talked a little bit about aeration, and fall is a perfectly good time to aerate the lawn. You do want to schedule your sprinkler system blowout, so make sure you have that on the schedule. And I've been on Nextdoor, and I know people are starting to advertise that. And if you've been battling perennial broadleaf weeds like dandelion or plantain or bindweed, fall is a great time to go after perennial weeds. So they will absorb herbicides more quickly because they're trying to store carbohydrates to put into the reserves to make it through the winter. And so they will more readily absorb the herbicides and go down a little bit more quickly. So it's a great time to go after them, and it's also cooler to time your application of herbicides so that you don't have volatilization or other issues with that. Any lawn care questions? That is like 5 slides. I could have a whole talk just on lawn care, but 5 slides.
Kenneth asks, is it better to apply compost to lawn or use fertilizer?
So compost, depending on what the compost is made from, the nutrient content is not going to be very consistent. So I would say that if you're actually looking to improve the overall health of the lawn, I would go with a structured fertilizer. And adding compost, it's hard to apply evenly, and it's probably best if you put it down and then aerate it to punch it into the soil. But I would focus more on fertilizer. If you want to use an organic option, there are many different organic fertilizers out there that all work really well.
Kaylin asks, are herbicides damaging to perennials?
Yes, they sure can be. That's a great question. So if you're spraying any sort of weeds in the lawn, we recommend spot spraying. So you are hovering directly over the weed and just giving it the application there. But That's where you don't want to use herbicides if it's too hot or if it's windy. Make sure that you are reading the label in its entirety and then applying it as directed. But yes, if you accidentally spray your perennials, you could result in damage.
And then Carol wants to know what she can use to kill weeds that's safe for her cat since she eats grass.
So Carol, most of the herbicides you'll have to make that decision. The recommendation, if you have concerns about kids or pets or other animals going on the lawn after you've sprayed, essentially, if the herbicide is dry, it's not going to rub off. But again, you are spot spraying the weeds, and if she's only eating the grass, she's not likely to consume the product. So, but that's a decision you have to make for your family and your cat's health.
You could grow some cat in a tray inside, or grass in a tray inside for the cat too.
There you go. You could also dig those by hand, Carol. So a couple other things that you would consider doing, I'm giving you a laundry list. Don't forget your garden tools. Your tools work really hard for you, so it's important to treat them with proper TLC. So clean them up, hose them off. Don't let dirt sit on the shovel for years and years and years. I'm telling myself this because I need to listen to what I say. But taking the time to maintain your tools is going to result in a longer life for your tools. They're not cheap. You've probably invested in a good pair of pruners, and it's not something that you should just throw on the workbench and let sit there. So remove any sort of dirt and debris using a wire brush. You can wipe things down with an oily rag and then sharpen them. That's a huge thing. You would be surprised at how much more productive a sharp shovel will be versus one that is dull. So there are places where you can sharpen them, or you can invest in the equipment and do it yourself. But take care of your tools. You can also consider planting some fall bulbs. So right now it's bulb time, and as long as you get them in the ground before the end of October, that is a good thing to do. So if you want some desperate fall or spring color, you can plant something like snowflakes and snowdrops. Those are the ones pictured here. They will come up in February usually and give you something fun to look at. But just make sure that you're getting your bulbs planted before the ground freezes. If you plant them into November, you'll probably get some blooms, but it's going to be a little bit more sporadic. Do plant them in full sun or part shade. If you have a buffalo grass lawn, you could do the famous crocus in the buffalo grass that bloom, and then the buffalo grass will green up later. Or if you're planting under a honey locust, that's a great option because it offers dappled shade. And flowers will last longer if they're not exposed to hot afternoon sun. So even in spring, we're getting some of those 80-degree days, and it can cause the flowers to be spent a little bit more quickly. A couple options are alliums. There are so many different alliums, and I have to say that I've become slightly obsessed with alliums. There are the big, huge pompon types. There are small ones. The great things about alliums is that they bloom for a long period, so you can really space these out. And after the flowers are spent, the spent flower is quite ornamental, kind of like a big poofy ball with really neat structure. So alliums are a great option, the ornamental onions. Crocus is kind of the spring darling. I absolutely adore crocus. Come in many different colors. There's striped ones, and they bloom early. And just last week at the Twilight Garden series, our state entomologist Whitney Cranshaw said that crocus are a really important source of nectar for early foraging honeybees. So you've probably noticed this if you have crocus, but plant some crocus. They're so cute. They do better when they're planted in mass. So group a few of them together, 5 to 10, and have a nice show, but also beneficial for our pollinators. Here's snowdrop. I love snowdrop and snowflake. They're what we call a minor bulb. So they're only maybe 2 to 3 inches tall, but I have to say, I squeal every time I see them come up in the spring. I just love them. And they are very early blooming, like February. You'll just all of a sudden see them, and then you just know that spring is only a few weeks away. Another option is daffodils. They're a classic flower. There are many different forms, shapes, colors of daffodils. Narcissus are very resistant. If you have issues with squirrels or skunks or raccoons digging up bulbs, they don't usually choose to feed upon narcissus, so that's also a good thing. And these will actually naturalize as well. So if you plant a few daffodils, they will grow and form larger clumps, and they'll start to naturalize in areas. They're also extremely reliable. All of these bulbs that I've talked about will come back year after year. A couple like hyacinths and tulips, they're not as reliable as the ones I've mentioned. Squill is a great blue flower, another one you could plant in a warm season lawn. This is also another one that naturalizes. If any of you are Iowa State grads, I am one, you will remember the squill on the Iowa State University campus in the spring. It is incredibly memorable and very, very beautiful. And then the last one is fritillaria. This is the checkered lily or the Turk's cap. Incredibly tropical looking. This is a showstopper. So the one on the left, they generally have colors of orange and yellow and white, and they form these very tall blooms, like 2 to 3 feet tall, and they smell like skunk. Kind of interesting. Every spring I'm like, ooh, there's a skunk, but I just remember that it's the fritillaria. They also have the checkered lilies, which are much smaller, but I think that photograph is not the greatest, but you can see how the petals are actually checkered. This is another minor bulb, so they're not very tall, they're not very showy. You have to really get on the ground and appreciate them. But these are another one that, because of their odor, are not appreciated by any sort of rodents or animals. But it is worth it. I have to tell you that the Turk's cap is a fantastic bulb that people should plant more. So to wrap it up with just a couple other tips, make sure that you are scheduling to get your irrigation systems blown out. Now is the time to get on seed and plant catalogs so you get excited for spring during the winter months. And I've noticed that they start sending them now before Christmas, whereas they used to send them in January. Just take some notes, what went well, what didn't go well. Look at your yard, start to do some basic landscape design, make plans to prune. Fall is not the time to prune your roses or your trees or anything woody. You want to save that until the spring. And then think about planting bulbs. So right now the garden centers are full of bulb selections. Throw a few in the ground. It's as easy as planting garlic. Just plant them 2 to 3 times as deep as the bulb height, and you can go ahead. I will give a mention to our additional fall gardening classes that CSU Extension is offering this spring. This Friday, we have Amy Lentz from the Weld County Extension Office talking about ornamental grasses at noon. These are all free for the public. You do have to register, and again, go to our cohorts blog website and click on gardening webinars. We do record these and also post them online just like this class for you guys. So scroll down of the current postings, and then halfway down the page you'll see all of the classes that we have recorded since April that have recordings, so you could watch yourself silly with gardening information that's available. But do check out those fall gardening classes. And then if you do have additional gardening questions, just contact Extension. That's what we're here for. There is my contact information. You're welcome to email me, or you can reach out to the Weld County or Larimer County Extension offices. We both have master gardeners that love to help and answer questions. So make sure that you are reaching out to us and allowing us to help you be successful in the garden. So I will take any final questions that you have, and I will definitely send Ruth these slides so that you can have a copy of those as well. So I'll leave you with ginkgo leaves, my favorite tree, that have beautiful yellow fall color that have fallen off after the first frost. So any final questions?
Someone asked how you can protect bulbs from squirrels, but I think you answered that with planting the daffodils.
Yeah, so species selection is important too. And then the other thing you can do is after you plant and once you put the soil back on top, you could then cover that with chicken wire and then put your mulch on top of that. So the chicken wire won't affect the growth of the bulbs, but when the squirrels start to dig, they're not going to want to dig into the chicken wire. So that's a good tip as well that you could try.
Kaylin wants to know, do I dig up gladiolas?
Yes, you sure do. So gladiolus are not a hardy bulb, so they're in the same category as dahlias, as cannas. So you do want to remove those. So you will let the frost basically kill back the top. You'll cut off the stem at the base, and then you will dig up the corms and you'll overwinter those. So stick them in either sawdust or wrap them loosely in newspaper and stick them in the basement or a cool, dry spot, and then replant after the first frost, or after May 15th, which is when our last average frost takes place. So yes, dig them up because they will not survive.
Okay, Kathleen wants to know, when should you prune hibiscus? And I'm kind of assuming this is hardy hibiscus.
The hardy hibiscus, I believe that hibiscus bloom, and Ruth, correct me, do they bloom on new growth? I think they do.
I think so.
Yes, that would be something I'd have to check, but I believe they bloom on new growth, so you could prune them in the spring before growth resumes. They bloom so late in the summer that I assume that they bloom on new growth. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Do roses need to be mulched?
Yes, I would mulch your roses. So take leaves or grass clippings or wood, whatever you can, and mulch about 1/3 up the canes. And just pile it around, and then once you start seeing new growth in the spring, you can pull that mulch back.
And wait until it freezes to do that?
I would wait, yes. So I wait until we get a hard freeze, water them prior to the hard freeze, and then mulch them after the fact.
And I really want to thank Allison for doing this for me. And I just realized I spelled your name wrong on that slide.
It's okay. It's close enough.
Okay, I'm not
Thank you,
seeing any
Ruth.
other
Thanks for
questions.
everybody for joining.
All right, and then we had a couple people just say thank you, thanks. Yep, lots of appreciative people, so great.
Super. Thanks,
you.
everybody.